like Farage doesn't want to talk about abortion. Like, he made that very clear when I spoke to him on the phone and earlier, and I got hung up on quite quickly when asked about abortion.
Did he hung up on you when you asked him about abortion?
Yeah, I asked him why he'd begun speaking out against abortion, at which point I don't know how I can swear on here, so I just won't, but said it was utter.
He killed you on.
There's so many loopholes, and the police, the authorities, they don't have the tools, they don't have the resources, the laws are fit for purpose. It came from a bank account in Russia. It was a foreign source. But because of our political financing rules in the UK, we can't do anything unless we can show that the donation was sent with the intent for it to be a direct donation to the Tory party, which is crazy.
Welcome back to Democracy for Sale. And this week, a story really caught my eye, a story from the New York Times about how a US anti-abortion group that actually we've written about before on Democracy for Sale, the Alliance of Defending Freedom, the ADF, has quietly built relationships with Reform UK and Nigel Farage, helping to channel kind of American Christian right influence into British politics under the banner of free speech. And I'm delighted to be joined today by one of the authors of that piece, Jane Bradley from the New York Times. Jane, welcome. Welcome to Democracy for Sale.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start at the start. How did this story come about? Like, how did you start to become interested in the ADF, who are big in the US, big in the US, but really have had no presence in the UK until recently? How did you start looking at them?
It started with most good stories start with a long lunch. I've been tracking the rise of Reform basically since I got back to work in January after maternity leave. And I've really been interested in kind of following their rise through financing, funding, influence, particularly obviously working for the New York Times. I'm very interested in US influence, whether it's money or more influence in terms of connections. So I'd been chatting to a Reform source over lunch and asking about kind of how they were doing with their funding and drumming up interest in the US. And that's when this source who I'd been chatting to all year mentioned the ADF. And your listeners will love this, and you haven't given me a tenner to say this, but the reason why they're on my radar when my source mentioned it at lunch is because of your article, Democracy for Sale. And I remember reading your fascinating article about how they were basically expanding in the UK in terms of funneling more money from the US operation into the UK. And I remember thinking at the time, I wonder where that money's going to. Why are they expanding in the UK? So then when this Reform source mentioned the ADF, and their phrasing was that, look, they're incredibly influential in the US and they are acting as a kind of power broker, a power player between the Trump administration, the White House, and the UK right. And that's how it began.
That's really, really interesting. I must say, I'm pleased to see that some of the stories on Democracy for Sale go that far and have that much influence. Like, what really struck me when I started looking at the ADF was, what they do essentially. I'd actually written about them before in my last book because of the work that they've done internationally. They've been very much at the kind of the forefront of moving into Europe and relationships with the European right. And they've got this model which is really all about court cases. They fund court cases. They get a lot of attention around court cases. And some people might remember, I was really struck actually reading your article because in the story I'd written for Democracy for Sale, it actually started off with Nigel Farage, comments he'd made about abortion. And he's somebody who hadn't really spoken that much about abortion before. And what you found was actually his comments about abortion, about term limits and kind of suggestion, actually, maybe these are all a bit too far. That came very soon after he'd been meeting with the ADF.
Yeah, that's one of the things that immediately interested me. I kind of had two questions when I started out. One, why is the ADF expanding in the UK and what do they want? And two, why has Nigel Farage suddenly started talking about abortion for the first time that I could recall in his 31-year political career? I basically, I started off speaking with the ADF. I reached out and just asked for an interview to ask about their UK work and kind of started doing a bit more digging into who they are, because I'd never heard of them until now. I haven't written about abortion before. And I think that tells you a lot about the role of religion and British politics, at least, because in the US, you couldn't cover American politics, I don't think, without at some point writing about the role of religion. Whereas here, in the UK, in England, certainly, it's very secular generally. So the ADF have this really kind of long-term strategy where in the US, they brought these legal cases against abortion buffer zones. So these are protected areas around abortion clinics, which are, designed to protect women, staff from harassment. And they use the same playbook in the US as we're seeing here in the UK. They started bringing these legal cases, not talking about, abortion limits, but around these buffer zones. And over in the UK, I think they're doing something very smart, which is they're framing the debate not around abortion, but around free speech, because these are protesters, Christians who are arrested for silently praying outside these clinics. And they're trying to frame it around this idea of it being a thought crime. This is not about abortion. It's about government censorship, basically. And they're using these court cases in the UK not to, incrementally overturn eventually the constitutional right for abortion. We know our courts don't work that way. It's all legislated through Parliament. They're kind of using it as a PR and lobbying tool. It's a way to change public mood, public opinion, so that even people who are pro-abortion, like, some of their supporters, are saying, well, okay, come on, but this is too far for arresting people who are just silently standing outside clinics. And that's kind of the main playbook over here, using these court cases to lobby and change public opinion around abortion rather than the law itself.
And interestingly, under this rubric of free speech, it's really striking that J.D. Vance actually talked about some of these court cases in this famous address in Munich in February, which was just, a kind of a historic and kind of the end of post-war, the kind of post-war settlement in terms of the relationship between the UK and the US. This was a historic moment. J.D. Vance basically saying, look, you guys can all go into the sea. And strikingly, one of the things he talked about in Munich was these cases taken by the ADF in Britain, which is incredible amount of influence.
Incredible. And obviously, that was the first thing I asked the ADF lawyers when I got them in a room. And I spoke to their head of UK advocacy, an Irish lawyer called Lorcan Price. And he kind of downplayed the significance or any role the ADF had in actively kind of briefing Vance or his team. He kind of put it down to their reach on Twitter, X, which they say has expanded under Musk's takeover of Twitter, and just general public outrage. But what was interesting is when I spoke to reform officials and US officials who Lorcan, the ADF, had spoken to directly about this exact matter, he had told them that they were very proud and very pleased because it was the work of the ADF who had got the facts, who had got the cases in front of Vance's team. Now, I don't know if he was, boasting to allies he wants to impress, or not being entirely truthful with the journalist asking him some direct questions. But the fact that you've got the vice presidents of the United States on one of the biggest international stages in politics, citing their cases, ADF cases, as an example of it's not even that as an example of censorship or free speech. He actually used it to attack an ally, the UK. So I think that really, from what I heard, really took the UK government by surprise when that happened.
And I guess what the ADF was very important, as you mentioned, in kind of overturning Roe versus Wade in this long culture war fight around abortion in America, which is, and it's striking how long it's been going on for. It really dates from the 70s on. I actually just recently read John Gantz's brilliant book when the Clock Broke, which actually talks a lot about in the 70s. Actually, the evangelical movement, at least the Baptists, actually were all very the Southern Baptists all welcomed Roe versus Wade and thought it was a very good thing. And it's I found myself actually reading a lot of religious books. I've read Tim Albert's book very recently as well, The Kingdom, the Power and the Glory, about US politics. And what's really striking is we assume, I think, that this is hardwired into American politics from the beginning. And actually, this has been quite a long influence operation that has been quite intentional in America as well.
It has. That's one of the things that struck me when I first started learning about the ADF and their work, is that they're incredibly, incredibly strategic, and they think in 50-year generational chunks. Like Roe v. Wade wasn't overturned in some of their activists, their lawyers' lifetime. And they're not thinking in terms of next year, even the next 5 years. They are thinking in these incremental steps of a whole generation, 50 years. And when I was chatting to my co-reporter on this, Elizabeth Dyers, who's written about the anti-abortion movement for years and knows American politics very well, my initial kind of response was, why are the ADF targeting the UK? Don't they know that like everyone basically supports abortion rights pretty much? It's got cross-party support. Almost 90% of the British public supports it. We don't have religion playing that central part in politics as we do in the US. So why are they coming to such a challenging environment, country, instead of pursuing, influence and power through the open door they kind of have under the Trump administration? What's the point? Is it going to be useless? And she was saying that that's exactly what we thought in the US. We thought abortion was a constitutionally protected right. I think it was my paper actually that had once written that this was a matter that was settled. And so the Americans were very complacent that this was a fundamental part of their constitution and was not under threat. But she said we shouldn't make the same mistake in the UK, even though it seems crazy. When you look at our political, cultural landscape right now, it's exactly what they thought and what happened in the US.
And were you surprised when you started looking into this? That, because Farage has kind of always styled himself as a kind of, not somebody who was particularly interested in religion, actually, quite strikingly. Somebody for whom, he kind of like, he's always poo-pooed, actually. He's a man with many divorces. He's actually always been a bit like, I'm not going to be sanctimonious about other people's relationships, in fairness to him. I think that's been his position. But these are people who are very, who are not. They're come from a very different place. I guess, were you surprised by that growing relationship between a party led by Farage and a very avowedly evangelical organization?
Yeah, I think in many ways, Farage is a really unlikely ally for the ADF. Like you said, he's described himself as pro-choice. He doesn't attend church. And in fact, he had a high-profile spat with the Church of England recently, calling it too woke. And the worlds are just very different. Like, I was at Reform Party conference in Birmingham last month, and I was just looking around at the nightclub, effectively, which was the conference. Flashing lights, loud music, everyone pretty merry, very sweary. And, 100+ miles away in London the next day was the big March for Life full of evangelical Christians that the ADF spoke at. And I was just struck by how different those two worlds are. And how that alliance must work. But that's kind of where we look to the US. And I think there's a similar relationship they're looking to build with Farage and the ADF with how Trump's relationship have played with the US anti-abortion movement, where they're both disruptors. They're not particularly religious. They don't particularly have a stance on abortion, but they've both been mutually beneficial to each other as they were on the up and trying to kind of grow their influence, grow their power. And they've kind of leveraged each other's audience, each other's following to create this kind of superpower, this kind of wave which helped Trump win his place at the White House for the second term.
And they have, I can't remember the exact biblical phrase, but they've got this phrase for Trump, which is basically, they compare him to an Old Testament character. I must confess, I cannot remember the name, much to my shame now, but who basically he's not a good man, he's not a great man in terms of, he's got moral failings, but he's the guy who's going to lead us kind of effectively into the promised land. And there is a lot of that kind of almost eschatological religious belief within this, that this is, this is a kind of, these are flawed men, but they're required to get us to the place, a place in which religion is a much bigger part in our public life than it does at the moment.
Yeah, and that's exactly actually what one US official told me who had been briefed by the ADF. I was asking kind of why have they focused on Farage? Why is he the alliance they're choosing to try and build? And they described it to me, or she said the ADF had described Farage as basically kind of the best out of a bad bunch, like not perfect, but the feeling was that the Tories, any Conservative candidates, Robert Jenrick was one name mentioned, was just too damaged by the 14 years the Conservatives have had in power, where they're responsible for at least some of the kind of online safety regulations, the censorship laws that the ADF and others are kind of rallying around. So it's felt that out of all the kind of marriages out there, it's not perfect, but it was the best fit for what they want to do and where they're at now.
And I think what I also took away from your reporting, I was at the Reform conference too, and like one thing that was striking actually was that while it did feel like a nightclub in many respects, it was a very odd gathering. I wrote a long piece for Unreviewed Books about it, and I found it a very odd gathering in many respects. But one thing I was struck at was, and it felt like in a growing kind of American presence. You had the Heartland Institute doing kind of sessions about why climate change is a con, a very, very well known, originally oil industry funded, originally actually kind of smoking, basically a kind of a big tobacco lobbying organization, now anti climate action. They were there. I actually met somebody from Infowars, Alec Jones's conspiracy theory outfit in the States. But also, I thought really significantly is a growing role of James Orr, and I've written a bit about James Orr before. So he's the guy behind the Centre for Better Britain think tank, who's very plugged into the worlds of national conservatism, very plugged into some of these similar worlds. I guess I was wondering in your report, did you start to see this kind of growing connection between Reform and particularly Farage and the kind of inner circle and the this branch of MAGA almost?
Oh, totally. Like, it's not just about reform for the ADF and this Conservative Christian Alliance. They are the most influential and they're one of the focus of their target. But what we found in the reporting was that there is this kind of unlikely alliance of generally groups, civil society groups, as well as academics, politicians on the right, on the conservative right, who are kind of coming together under this mantle, under this mission of fighting censorship. And it's not just the ADF and Farage, which is an unlikely alliance in many ways. You've also got groups like the FSU, the Free Speech Union, who we spoke to actually for the piece, and it was quite interesting because it was clear while they were unified with the ADF and others on the free speech line of attacks, the mission there, they were definitely not part of the religious aspect. Like, they were like, we just keep, we let the ADF take care of the religious thing. We're not religious. That's not our thing. We're aligned on free speech, but not the religious side of things. And I think that also speaks to the alliance that the ADF has been building with Farage as well. Like, Farage doesn't want to talk about abortion. Like, he made that very clear when I spoke to him on the phone earlier, and I got hung up on quite quickly when asked about abortion.
Did he hung up on you when you asked him about abortion?
Yeah, I asked him why he'd begun speaking out against abortion, at which point I don't know how I can swear on here, so I just won't, but said it was utter...
It kills you off.
6 times, and said that abortion was number, I think it was 468 on Reform's agenda. And that kind of matches what I'd been hearing from the Reform officials I've been speaking about. To them, this is about free speech, or that's what they want to get behind. They privately said, we're not aligned. These guys are too conservative on the abortion religious stuff for us. It's the free speech stuff that we want to be talking about, not abortion, because they know it's not going to win over, the British voters, the moderate conservatives, the disaffected working class voters that they need, or that Farage needs, if there's any chance of him ever becoming prime minister.
Although I think it's striking that one of the most high-profile Tory defectors recently was Danny Kruger. And Danny Kruger is without a doubt, I think, the most evangelical, or one of the most evangelical voices in the House of Parliament, one of the most evangelical conservative voices as well. I think it's fair to say, not just, there is liberal evangelicals. I think Danny Kruger is a conservative evangelical. If you look at the turn his politics has taken over the course of his growing religiosity, I think it's very striking. And I must say my antenna did prick up when I saw he's been given a very important role within Reform now.
I actually haven't heard about that role. Tell me about it.
Oh, I think he's a head of policy or preparing for government or something like that. Sorry, I was hoping you were going to jump in with the exact phrase.
I was in the middle of last minute edit. that I didn't come up.
No, no, it's fine. No, this is how we roll on this pod on this show. Yeah, he's got a very important role now. So he's been brought in. I spoke to reform, like kind of backroom reform people who were very pleased to bring him in. Talked about his experience in government, etc., etc. But they wouldn't be drawn on his religiosity. But it's quite striking, and he spoke at the National Conservatism Conference in London a few years ago. But more generally, I think it's fair to say him and Miriam Cates were very much on the religious right of the Tory party, the kind of Catholic social teaching side of the Tory party, evangelical, very, like, I think, kind of, if not overtly anti-abortion, clearly pushing in that direction. I thought that was really striking to see someone with his pedigree being put into quite an important position, and it felt more important than that in which other Tory defectors have been brought in. Often they're just kind of placeholders for conference, whereas he seems to have a real role.
I took note when he defected to reform because I thought it was very interesting for that reason. His views on abortion, on gay marriage, and kind of like very much to the kind of very conservative right of the party. And I think it reflects the kind of the crossroads a little bit of where reform's at as a party. And I don't know if you felt this at the conference, but to me, the conference completely, Reform Party conference, symbolized like the divide between the old party full of eccentrics who might say something that's going to get them in trouble on Radio 4 versus the new party, which are a lot of former Tories who were very slick, more moderate. And it was kind of these two worlds colliding at the conference. I think we can see that again in the Danny Kruger defecting, but at the same time, they're also winning over more moderate Tories as well, Tory defectors. And they kind of need to figure out what they're going to be as a party and who they're trying to appeal to, because you're right, these two strands are going to appeal to very different voters, if any at all. And even James Orr, who you mentioned earlier, the Cambridge academic, he's heading up a reform-affiliated think tank, right? So he's also very much part of the world, and he cropped up at a few of the meetings that we discovered the ADF had brokered, kind of behind closed doors. It really reflects this kind of growing, sometimes a natural alliance between the conservative Christian right and the populist movement over here.
And how important is GB News in all of this? GB News has now got a much bigger US footprint. Paul Marshall, I've written about quite a bit before. He was actually striking. The meetings were taking place in Paul Marshall's cafe, the one he owns, Queen Street near Westminster. GB News, obviously, Marshall owns half of that. It's been really pushing a lot of reform agendas. Like, how important is GB News in this kind of firmament?
It's a really good question. Like you say, the secret meeting that we found out the ADF had brokered between Farage and a really influential Trump appointee at the State Department, official who's kind of leading on the free speech issue on Europe and kind of attacks on the UK and Europe. That obviously took place at Old Queen Street Cafe, as you say, owned by Paul Marshall and Head, and also actually at one of the other meetings. So there was a US delegation of lawmakers who visited London back in July to talk about basically the free speech crisis in Europe and the UK. And this was the one where Farage ended up hosting it. The ADF invited him. He ended up chairing a discussion around free speech in the UK. And we actually did a report in the piece just because we ran out of word count. But GB News, its CEO, was there as well. They were part of the coalition, the alliance of these groups. The FSU, the Free Speech Union, James Orr, somebody from X, from Twitter there. They were there. So I definitely have a question about kind of what is GB News's role in this. And I think it's answers we don't fully have. And I'd like to understand better because there's definitely an involvement there.
One area I thought was very interesting in your work you've been doing really since you came back about reform, a bit like me as well, you're very interested in reform's finances. Like, where's the money coming from behind this? Like, who's getting behind it? And I guess, how important, before we delve into the kind of the stuff we know about, like how important are these networks in terms of funding? It's striking. Like James Orr has talked about raising money in the States for the Centre for a Better Britain. For the Reform are now taking donations in crypto. Obviously, they say that they will abide by all electoral commission rules, but there's lots of ways in which you can influence our politics without giving money to a political party, as we've often reported on here. Like, so how important is there a financial aspect to all this?
Well, I think at this stage, our reporting does not show a financial aspect yet. What it shows is kind of it's really the genesis of their relationship, the ADF's courting of reform, and this is purely about influence through networks, through connections. But what we do know about the ADF, its long history, is it has incredibly deep pockets. It's incredibly influential in the White House with advocacy groups, rich funders in the US, and Farage and Reform they've not been shy about talking up how much money they're going to fundraise and how they're going to overtake the Tories and how important money is to the rise of the party. And that's why I started looking at it. I'm not actually interested in money, money in itself. It's about what it says about influence and power, right? And to me, in politics, particularly in like the MAGA populist world, there's so much briefing and so much hot air and people saying one thing and like, can you trust them, can you not? Whereas money is a tangible way to show the influence, the growth, the rise of it. And that's when I kind of first hooked onto Reform as, a party we should be taken seriously. Look, it's a long, long way to the general election, but I don't think anyone can deny that the growth they've seen in the last year has been staggering. And I think we saw the first signs of that through them appointing Nick Candy, the billionaire, as their new treasurer. His big promises, many of which have yet to be fulfilled, about all the millions he's going to raise. So I think money is so important in politics for showing this power and influence, but also it doesn't start with money. What comes before money is always the networking, it's the smoothing, it's the building of relationships, and often money will follow after that.
And could you talk us through a bit of the work you've done actually charting Reform's donations, the donor base, and how it has changed? Like, what did you start to look at there, and what did you find?
Yeah, so we did a deep dive into who was funding Reform earlier this year, and we basically just looked at the public donations on the Electoral Commission, the Register of Political Donations. And I wanted to look at it as kind of a first early sign on whose influence they're winning over. Like, who is attracted to the party policy, which friends, which allies are they winning? And there were kind of a few big takeaways from that. And this was back in March. So we know some of this now, but I think it was an early sign for the party's kind of trajectory and where it's focusing, where its policy is winning friends and supporters. And those takeaways were, one, that they were attracting a lot of former Tory donors who were defecting from the party. And that was a sign that the Tory party were in trouble, quite a bit before we knew just quite how much trouble they were in, before it started being shown in the polls. The other thing I found was there were a hell of a lot of offshore funders, people who lived, individuals or companies who were registered in offshore low tax jurisdictions. There were a lot of fossil fuel investors as well, climate change skeptics, that kind of thing. And that to me was interesting when you looked at the Reform's policy, what they put out in their first manifesto, and you read that, promise of tax breaks, which, there's now some peddling back on, a kind of a dismissal of green energy, climate change, and kind of a promise to focus on developing business in the fossil fuel industry, sectors like that. So I think it's going to be really interesting what Reform do in terms of attracting foreign donations, which is something I'm particularly interested in, because they kind of got themselves in a bit of hot water at the start of the year, when we would talk about that rumored donation from Musk, 100 million, I think it was, which ended up coming to nothing. And they've had a lover's tiff since then. But it raised a lot of questions. And it's something you have reported on as well for a long time, Peter. But our political financing system is a mess. There's so many loopholes, and the police, the authorities, they don't have the tools, they don't have the resources, the laws are fit for purpose. And I think it really made certainly Labour sit up and take notice and think this is something we've got to fix, because if Reform did get that 100 million pound donation from a billionaire like Musk, that would completely change the political game with one single donation, because that was more than any political party, even the Conservatives, got that entire year. So that then leads to questions about foreign influence and whether people who don't live in the UK should be kind of influencing British politics. And yeah, so reforms since then have kind of, they want to attract a lot of their potential donors from places like Dubai, Monaco, offshore tax jurisdictions, things like that. But they've also got to be very careful because, as we know, they frame themselves as, you know, the party of the people and putting British interests first. So they've got to kind of marry that with, we want the deep pockets of these billionaires who live in offshore tax jurisdictions, but how do we fit that with our promises to, you know, to take back Britain for ordinary people?
I think it's really striking if you look at, you know, as you did, like when you started to map the donation patterns, you know, you saw like a lot of people with as you say, like with investments in fossil fuels, energy companies, a lot of people with interest in offshore, a lot of just frankly very super rich people as well. At the moment, they're doing a piece of work, Democracy Say, look, just looking at the sign, like kind of the increasing concentration of money. And one of the things I'm often thinking about with reform, particularly internationally, is that, you know, as you get up towards a general election, compared to say the US, you know, when I first started doing this work, I thought, look, there's way more money in America. Still, there's way more money in American politics. It's huge. It's billions and billions. So it's a much worse in America, this issue, than it is in Britain. But actually, they run the same way. They're very similar political systems, private money fundamentally. And actually, because there's a lot less money can actually make a big difference. And, you know, it's not that hard to imagine a scenario in which you're going up towards a general election and someone like Elon Musk or someone else is, you know, is able to use British companies, for example, to donate, etc. And by the time you even see some of that money, you know, the election's been and gone.
Exactly. And that's, I think, the key point. And when I'm pitching these kind of stories to my editors at the New York Times here, you know, political financing, donation ones, I always have to contextualize it to be like, I know this isn't a lot of money for America. I know this feels like peanuts to you, but this is a lot of money in UK terms. And yes, it's a smaller amount, but it has the potential to make a much bigger impact in British politics than it would in America, because we don't have all these deep pockets and this huge money, and it can change an election campaign. And there was a story I did a few years ago actually about the former Conservative Party treasurer who had given, he was one of the biggest donors to the Conservative Party, and he'd given this big donation, it was over £100,000, to the party that the National Crime Agency had, through his bank, traced back to Russia, basically, to his father-in-law, who lived in, had a bank in Russia. And when I spoke to law enforcement sources, financial crime sources, they basically said to me off the record that look, we know, we have evidence it came from a bank account in Russia. It was a foreign source. But because of our political financing rules in the UK, we can't do anything unless we can show that the donation was sent with the intent for it to be a direct donation to the Tory party, which is crazy, because unless you have an email saying, darling Sherlock, here's some money for the Conservative Party, like, you just don't have that smoking gun. And I've covered financial crime, looked into money in the UK for nearly 2 decades. And that was the closest to a smoking gun I've got, like being able to actually follow the money trail from Russia to the father-in-law to directly to the Conservative Party bank account, not through any, like, you know, offshore vehicles or anonymized shell companies, directly from this guy's bank account. And the authorities are here going, well, because of our laws, we can't do anything about it unless we can show intent. And that meant, as he did, the guy's father-in-law could just say, oh, I sent you the money just to decorate my daughter's flat. It's up to you what you do with it afterwards. If it happened to be a few days before I sent it, if it happened to be a few days after I sent it that you sent to the Conservative Party, that's just a coincidence.
I find this is an issue that, you know, and your reporting on NHL was fantastic on this for just flagging it up. But actually, we saw it with Aaron Banks as well during the Brexit referendum, when the National Crime Agency was investigating him. It eventually found nothing to see there. But they, at the time, were asked, you know, would this be an impermissible donation if this was found to be the proceeds of crime? And they were able to say none, that we they weren't able to clarify, they weren't actually able to say that proceeds of crime would be an impermissible donation, which is just incredible. There's so many things like this. And in the art world, you've got anti-money laundering laws, you've got loads of other stuff, whereas political parties, really, there's almost no onus on them to check anything. They've a cursory Google and you're fine to, away you go.
Yeah, yeah, and we even had MI5 come out this week, I think, and say that to basically be on the lookout for, and it was China in particular in this case, but for foreign nations trying to influence British politics. In particular, one point I noted is how they will use British nationals as proxies to make political donations, which ties into the Shelag, the Conservative Party story I was talking about. But it's staggering that you've got the intelligence services warning about these. You've got, police officers, regulatory investigators warning that, hey, we can't investigate this. We can't enforce this with the rules we have. And yet nothing's really done. I know there was a lot of promises at the start of the year from Labour, but I don't think we've seen any real action there, at least not from what I've heard.
And just bringing back into some of the work you've done before, which was really striking. You've done a lot of work, as you say, on financial crime, but you've done a lot of stuff on Russia and Russian influence in Britain. Like, do you think, are we seeing kind of almost like a shift from oligarch and kleptocrat money to kind of ideological influence, or is this kind of all part of the same continuum, do you think?
I think that's a good question. What I'm hearing in briefings with what I'm hearing in briefings from people investigating this kind of thing is that we've kind of the biggest threat they're seeing these days, from an intelligence perspective, from a financial crime and talking sanctions, things like that perspective, is state-sponsored threats. And that's changed. Like before, the focus was on kind of corporate misbehavior or individuals, like you say, oligarchs. But there's really been this shift away to, yeah, as I said, we're talking about Russia, China, state activity, whether it's sanctions evasion, whether it's kind of political meddling. We had a case in Canada a couple of years ago where it was found that China was trying to influence federal elections over there. So I think that's much harder for the authorities over here to deal with, right? Because they're much more sophisticated. They've got a lot more resources at stake. And they're really, I think, trying to find a way to shift the focus of their enforcement work to reflect now this change in threat. It's no longer the oligarchs. It's no longer the corporate companies. I mean, they're still there, but that's not the main threat.
And when you talk about Russia, I think it's worth it. We would be remiss not to say that a former Brexit Party, then Reform leader in Wales, Nathan Gill, has effectively pled guilty to accepting bribery from Russia for making statements, pro-Russia position statements in Ukraine, the European Parliament. There's been a lot of history of questions around senior figures that are in and around the Reform Party and their links to Russia. Is this something we should also be thinking about too? We do talk, and I talk right a lot about the US relationship, but is this relationship with Russia, given that we know Russia has tried to destabilize many countries, is that something we should be thinking and writing about an investigation too?
Oh yeah, I think we should be doing that for the past 10 years, but we definitely should still be doing that. Yeah, no, I think it's a really important issue. I mean, I spent a lot of the Conservative Party's years in governments looking at Russian donations there, Russian connected donations and influence there. I think there have been some questions raised about reform, of course. You mentioned Nathan Gill there. I've also seen like a major corporate donor of theirs who had been connected to Russia as well, and some sales over there. So I think it's something we should definitely stay on. But we should also be looking at other state-sponsored threats as well. We're hearing a lot about China, obviously, with the news at the moment with the spy case. It's not just Russia, and in a way, I keep trying to get away from Russia because I've been writing about it for so long, and I'm kind of like, Russia must be getting bored of this. There must be somebody else to write about. But I keep getting pulled back into Russia because the stories keep coming. But that could also be because I don't have as good sources on things like China. But I think we should be looking at Russia for sure, but there are also other states, other countries we should be looking at, like China.
And I guess, has anything meaningful changed, do you think, in Britain as regards that? Like, we had, I'm always struck that, when the Ukraine war happened, basically the upper echelons of the Tory party turned around and went, oh my God, we've got this terrible problem in Britain about London grad. It's awful. It's like, you guys literally spent 20 years building this up and taking money from these people. And they all made these huge statements, and we're going to get rid of these slaps cases, which I've written about a lot too, about lawfare, about how basically the rich can buy silence in this country. We're going to clean up everything. My read is not that much has changed since then, or am I being horribly cynical?
It's our job to be horribly cynical. I might be a tiny bit less cynical, but only a tiny bit. I would say I think the political will has changed, right? From, when I was first writing about Russia back in 2015, like obviously pre-Skripal, pre-Ukraine war, not long after the murder of Alexander Litvinenko. Like, in that case, like Theresa May, then Prime Minister, had literally in writing written a letter saying we need to consider the economic consequences of pursuing this case against Russia. Like, I don't think any Prime Minister today would at least put something like that in writing, or I think that way, at least about Russia. So I think there's been a shift finally in political will. But the thing about that is you can finally change your political will after journalists, activists, everyone's been banging on about for years the dirty money, the influence problem with Russian money in the UK and other money. But if you haven't spent the time kind of resourcing your financial crime investigators, your anti-corruption investigators, the right units with the right skills, the right people, then it's all very well having a change of heart if you don't have the tools, the resources, the training to actually enforce and do something about it. And like even the big, shiny, new unexplained wealth orders that we've heard so much about, I think there's only been about 11 that's been actually deployed, issue that's been won in over a decade, which is like around one a year. And they found that when they've come up against some of these oligarchs or these state connected wealthy officials, EPEPs, that they actually often lose the case because they're not equipped to take them on. So I think we need to see a lot more change for for all the promises to have an effect.
And what about, about you, in your work, like where are you going to going now with this? Like, what's the next frontier in this kind of reporting that you've been doing? You've been looking a lot at reform. You've been looking a lot, I think, and I think it's fair to say that influence in Britain has been a big part of your work over the last 10 years. Like, where do you see this work going next?
Definitely something to look at with Elon Musk and Tommy Robinson, who've been hearing in court. I think it depends on the kind of the political agenda and the geopolitical events. I'm always looking, like in this job, and I'm sure you are as well, I'm always looking for like what's the new emerging trend that has a connection to wider geopolitical events that hasn't yet been reported or that we don't properly understand. And for me, the focus is very much on influence and state-sponsored threats and political influence and things like that. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch what happens with China. Obviously, Russia's still going to be a big story. And, I don't know if this is going to be me or my colleagues in Washington, but there's going to be a lot to look into in Gaza, we expect, if the next stage of the peace deal goes through and we start looking at rebuilding and all of that. I think that's going to be an interesting issue to look at.
Well, I think unfortunately we are living in a golden age of corruption and of conflicts of interest. We've never seen these sort of levels of relationship between business. I think, with the Trump White House, and what we're seeing is a kind of almost normalization that your business and your political life are almost kind of symbiotically linked, and it's hard to see where one starts and the other one ends.
It's extraordinary. When I speak to like colleagues who have been investigating, who've been looking into kind of all of Trump's business deals and all of the rest, it's like if he wasn't doing it in the open, it would be a big corruption investigation expose. But he's coming out, and his affiliates, his family members, they're just doing it in the open and shrugging their shoulders. So it's kind of like, but what do you call it? How do you report on it? And how do you keep up with it? And someone who's just saying, hey, yeah, we're doing this and there's nothing wrong with it. It's all about the deal, baby.
And it's kind of fascinating to watch how in Britain that mentality has taken hold, like in in different way, like a smaller way. Even going to reform conference, the first thing you see is Nigel Farage selling gold. He gets paid like a small fortune with a gold company. You've got GB News who basically just break the rules because they can, and they realize that they can do it. And we have quite strong impartiality rules in Britain. They just kind of drive a coach and horses through them, and you can start to see how all those norms of what used to be how we did things can really decay, like really quite quickly actually. And the things that might once have shocked or might once have made people gone, oh my god, that's a terrible thing, people would have resigned or whatnot, become actually like you care about that almost. It becomes a kind of that almost becomes a badge of honor.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but I've found it as an investigative journalist, I've found it harder and harder, I don't know, in the past 5 years, maybe a bit longer, to make an impact and really shock people with stories because one, the news is so relentless and there's just kind of one crazy bad thing after the other. But the other thing people have just got used to, since in the UK, Boris Johnson's era and the COVID pandemic and all the nepotism, the corruption over the procurement over there, people, I think that really had an impact on the public distrust in politicians and also kind of what they expect of them. And I did a lot of reporting, I know you did some as well, about all the kind of the government's questionable response to the
Yeah,
pandemic, and
massively.
particularly procurement and profiteering and all of that. And by the end, like start off the start of the year, people were shocked. And then by the end, they're like, "Oh, what do you expect?" type thing. So most of my stories, I put out, people just reply, "Not surprised."
I think there's a huge, it's probably a conversation for another day, but there's a huge, it's something I think about all the time. Like how, if part of what we do is to find stuff out and one reason you spend so long doing it, you think something's to change. And if it just ends up being kind of met with both either a shrug or a shrug and a, well, they're all like that, it can feel sometimes slightly like you're pushing up, you're Sisyphus pushing that big boulder up that big hill.
But we've got to keep pushing it.
We
Then,
do, that's,
and they can't say they didn't know. I feel like that's the least we can do. There's a record.
Jay, thank you so much. I think keep pushing it up, because pushing the ball up the hill feels like quite an apt place to end today's discussion. But like, huge thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Peter.